GM, good morning. Welcome to the Milk Road Show, the daily crypto show that is like a caffeine boost for your brain, but without the jitters. I'm your host, Kyle Reedhead, filling in for Jay, who is out sick. He's got a bug today. So I'm jumping in to sit here with Michael Nadeau, founder of the DeFi Report, a leading newsletter in the crypto industry. On today's show, we'll be discussing Michael's two recent reports on one, where are we in the cycle, and two, Solana's valuation versus ETH. We'll dive into some different questions, including what's driving the narrative behind Solana's growth currently, what upcoming catalysts could wake up Ethereum this cycle, and has the ETH BTC ratio bottomed? Has Bitcoin dominance bottomed? Have we topped in the cycle? All these things we're going to be answering. Before we get into that, a couple things we got to cover. One, we're doing a pro AMA this week. So you want to take a second to address all the Milk Road pros and all your questions. We've got so many new pro subscribers over the last couple of weeks. It's been really heating up, and we know you guys have questions, but we've got some answers. So this Wednesday, the 27th at 11 a.m. EST, we're hosting an exclusive AMA just for you. So there's a link in the show notes below. You can hit us with your toughest questions inside the Discord. Just fill out that form, and we will answer them for you. If you're not yet pro, come on, what are you waiting for? Let's go pro already. We want to answer your questions. So check out the link in the descriptions below. All right, before we get into the episode, let's take a quick second just to hear from our sponsors that make this show possible.
Meanwhile is the world's first licensed and regulated life insurance company built for the Bitcoin economy. They do everything in BTC. You pay in BTC, they pay claims to your family in BTC. You take out policy loans entirely in BTC when you need liquidity. Protect your family from life's uncertainty and a broken financial system. Build intergenerational Bitcoin wealth while the cost of living skyrockets in dollar terms. Plus, get all the tax and legal benefits of life insurance now in Bitcoin. Visit milkroad.com/meanwhile to join the waitlist and get early access to the world's first Bitcoin life insurance. Whether you're bullish or bearish on MicroStrategy, T-Rex ETFs are your gateway to dynamic market plays. Get exclusive access to leveraged exposures with the first 2x short or 2x long ETFs designed specifically for MicroStrategy stock. Position yourself with precision. With T-Rex, you gain access to powerful tools for sophisticated investors.
All right, Michael, we're back. We're ready to talk here today. You were on the episode or on the podcast. What was it? Earlier this year, I think pre-Milk Road branding, actually, in the Web3 Academy days. So welcome back. First of all, pumped to have you here.
Thanks, Kyle. Always good to chat with you, man.
Absolutely. Look, I love reading your research. It's very aligned with Milk Road Pro and a lot of the research that we talk about. But you have some of the best reports, some of the best on-chain analysis and just overall analysis, I think, in crypto. And so we want to pick your brain. And I think we'll start things off sort of open concepts here and a little bit broad and just say, where do you think we are in the cycle currently? We've obviously had a crazy run over the last couple of weeks here with after Trump getting elected. Maybe things are getting a little bit hyped, a little bit crazy at the moment. We're getting close to 100K. Maybe we're in a bit of a pullback right now, at least in Bitcoin. What's your take on where we are in the cycle and overall with the markets?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. That is the $1 million question. I think there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, we just made a pretty big move for Bitcoin, jumping from mid 60s or so up to just barely up to 99K, where we haven't kissed 100K just yet, but we're getting close. So pretty big move, I would say, over a pretty short period of time. Kind of reminds me of Q4 2020. It does sort of feel like that's kind of where we're at. We had a similar pretty big move in Bitcoin. Bitcoin tends to sort of lead these really kind of bull market phases. I think we're in that sort of early state. Actually, we'll call it middle of the cycle, since the bull run to me really started at the beginning of 23, but we haven't reached that sort of extreme pitch of it just yet. To me, that is to come. We can go through. There are some signs out there that the market is heating up, and we look at on-chain data. We look at a lot of sentiment-related data, so we can go through some of that. But I think, certainly some signs that the market is heating up, but I don't see this extreme greed out there. I see actually more people calling the top, which people that were around last cycle or 17, nobody was calling the top. I mean, if you called the top, people were screaming at you and telling you were an idiot. So everyone was talking about the super cycle. So like the vibe out there, yes, it does feel a little extreme. You got pumped up fun, you got some weird stuff happening, but like I don't see the extreme greed or the super cycle discussion, any of that just yet. So
It can definitely get a lot weirder. If you're around last
yeah.
cycle, then it can get really weird. I mean, if you look on Pumped Up Fund, it is already very weird. But
Yes.
it's interesting. It does really feel like 2020, Q4 2020 right now. What I have up on the chart right now is just Bitcoin's price chart. And you can see October, November, December, they were just massive months. It actually continued into January, February, and March. But what's interesting is even in 2020, altcoin season really didn't start until, and like the craziness didn't start probably until more like January. If I was to flip over to ETH, which I guess I could do, I just don't think it's set up right now, but let's just look at it actually. ETH's like big moment here, if you look, was really in January. That's when it had its massive run, and it went from like, $700 all the way to almost, $4,200, $4,300, right?
Yeah.
And that started in January. And most of the sort of like smaller tokens, that's what happened last cycle as well. So Bitcoin kind of ran on its own, and people, I think, kind of forget that. And so I agree, there's still lots of room left, at least in the rest of the market. And if we compare back to last cycle, you put this in your report, which I thought was quite interesting. Why don't you share this chart? This is YouTube views.
Yeah, YouTube views. I think like there's a number of different sentiment metrics that I'm looking at. I think this one's pretty interesting. This gives you an idea of like retail out there, and it's looking at, this is from Ben Cohen. So shout out to Ben Cohen. It's looking at almost all the top, YouTube channels out there. And we're at like, 50% or so of kind of where we got to in terms of like the number of views on these popular channels. So to me, like that chart, I believe will peak up again. And that will come, like you said, after we sort of get this repricing. I think it happens again in January. There's a reason that it happened in January last cycle. I think a lot of institutions, a lot of like larger money managers, they're going into year end right now. They're trying to process what just happened with Trump being elected, with potentially new regulation, like what's happening. Like they don't just like deploy all their capital like right away. And so I think there's a reason it happened in January last cycle. I think there's a reason it's going to happen again, probably in 25. And yeah, I'm expecting, more new users. I still think we're mostly like crypto natives, like in the market right now. We're seeing signs certainly of new users coming in, but we'll know when this chart starts to peak up a little bit more.
Yeah, we're not even as high as we were back when the Bitcoin ETFs got approved back in
Right.
what is that, January, February kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so there's still a lot of room to go. I will say, like just internally for Milk Road, our metrics have skyrocketed since Trump took over. Just the last like not even 3 weeks or whatever it's been. Our pro subscribers are now like tripling, quadrupling on a daily basis from what they were previously. Our YouTube views are kicking up, and our podcast views. So we're starting to see things really start to pick up, but it still feels a little bit early days. We also run a marketing agency that works with many media companies in crypto, and we saw this last cycle as well. The views and these things are actually a really good metric to tell you like where the bull market's at, because retail comes in and what do? They start subscribing to podcasts, subscribing to newsletters, they start buying tools, etc. And when you start to see them actually getting their credit cards out and buying things, that's a sign like, hey, they're back and they're actually coming now. And so that's definitely different than what we saw earlier this year. So I think that is a pretty good indicator, but I think there's still a lot more room for a lot of new retail to come in. And as you said, institutions, what's your thoughts around just like maybe macro? You don't have to go in depth here, but it feels to me like a lot of this price action has nothing to do with macro. It's mainly just because crypto is going to be legal in the US because Trump, but there's still like rates are still high. QE hasn't really started at all. So any take around that as well?
Yeah. So it's interesting to hear your perspective on, it's nice that you have a media presence and you can kind of see these things. I'm seeing this on the DeFi report as well. And things are definitely picking up. On the macro stuff, like I'm looking at a number of different data points there. Like I like to really combine like a deep understanding of what's happening with macro, with sort of on-chain data, fundamental analysis in crypto. And I think the economy is sort of in this somewhat of a Goldilocks state right now. I shared some of this in the report that we put out. The thing that gives me a little pause is like the dollar is increasing and the 10-year. So I think the market is trying to like understand, are we potentially going into like more inflation? Or is this just sort of like Trump's coming in? We're sort of repricing like just more growth and more GDP growth. And so rates have to go up for that. That's kind of the question. My base case is that inflation is not a huge concern to me right now. I'm looking at oil prices and like, there's not, especially if Trump comes in and like unleashes a lot of supply in the U.S. I just don't see oil like getting really, really overheated. That's really what's going to drive a lot of inflation. Fed has to hike. That kills risk assets. But like everything else that I look at in terms of like global liquidity indicators, just what's happening with like sort of Fed and what they're signaling, I think they're probably going to cut again. I think they're going to have to. With Trump coming in, all the various policies that he's going to implement, I don't see any like nothing's making me super nervous out there. Of course, things can happen. But to me, the one thing to look at is the dollar, and the dollar strengthening at the same time that crypto is rallying. That is a little bit of a idiosyncratic action there.
Yeah. A little dicey. I remember saying when we were right here in September, we kind of hit that bottom. I was like, okay, we're going to break through. This is the next phase of the bull market. And then it just went the complete opposite way. I was like, oh, okay. But then crypto went up with it. And I was like, well, this is very weird. What's going on here? So that is the one thing to watch. I think, again, that's just pricing in Trump, and people are excited about the US and they're going to be a dominant player again, and et cetera, et cetera. But we'll see what happens. It's right at that kind of key top area. So hopefully it comes down from there. But I don't know. It's anyone's guess on what happens. I think in your report, what was really nice, and we use a very similar metric, and we've had a few people on over the last like 2 weeks that were talking about this, which was MVRV. Although you break it down a little bit differently, you look at long-term versus short-term, which is just a great idea to see like how we hit the top. And I think, Bitcoin hasn't 100K yet. So to me, it feels too premature to even be asking this question. But like you said, I've seen it on Twitter. There are people trying to say, are we at the top already? Should we be taking profits? What is your MVRV stats show?
Yeah, I think right. There are signs. Like you do see some stuff on Twitter, and you see stuff in the sentiment. You see some things that look like I saw like the president of El Salvador like posting like his gains on Twitter. Right, that looks like sort of toppy to me. So I can see why people are sort of calling some of this out. But then you go on chain and you kind of look at things, and I think the MVRV is always a nice indicator. It's essentially telling you like what are the profits that like the average holders are sitting on out there. And with Bitcoin, like long-term holders tend to sit on gains. They look to get like multiples, right? So if you're sitting on 200%, 250% gains, which is really where we're at right now, that to me is not like a cycle peak. In the last cycle, the MVRV for long-term holders got up to 11.4. We're at like 3.9. That was on the Z score. We're actually looking at the regular MVRV. So that peaked out at about 4 last cycle. We're at like 2.6 right now. So it's sort of getting back to where we were in March, when the Bitcoin ETF had just come out. So that just looks to me like there's some room to run. Now we're looking at short-term MVRV. Bitcoin's basically at all-time highs, so everybody is in profit right now, even the short-term holders. This is at a level of, I think it's at 1.3 right now. It peaked out at 1.8. So short-term holders are coming in. They're sort of chasing the market. And last cycle, they were sitting on about 80% gains when the cycle peaked. Right now, they're sitting on average about 30% gains. So again, I don't think this is a metric that sort of offsets some of the sort of greed stuff that you're seeing on Twitter, maybe.
Yeah, I agree. Sounds like and feels like there's still plenty of room to run. However, what do you think about Bitcoin dominance? So this chart I think has surprised some people. Some people were kind of calling this, but I think a lot of people have called the top for Bitcoin dominance, which, by the way, for those that don't know what that is, that's just taking the Bitcoin market cap, comparing it versus the rest of the market cap. Usually it peaks out at some point. Usually it's around like 12 months left in the bull market. It peaks out, then it heads down, and that's when you get your proper alt season. We, again, have not had that yet. So even though it's like exciting and everything's up and things are going crazy, we technically don't have like a real altcoin season yet. Bitcoin dominance has not topped, although maybe it has now. I don't know. Do your thoughts on Bitcoin dominance? Do you see a top here at all? Or maybe you look at ETH BTC instead. I'm not sure what you look at or what you think about here.
Yeah, I think we're getting close. And I think we're at what is the percentage we're at right now?
58.75%. The highest we went was 61.5.
Yeah, so we are like getting close to that peak. I think, I think it probably peaks out after Bitcoin hopefully pierces through the 100K mark sometime here between now and the end of the year. So I'm looking for that like next move for Bitcoin to go through 100, and that will be sort of the peak for Bitcoin. And then going into next year, I think a lot of people are going to start to look at the ETH ETFs, and like, one thing that's interesting to me is like ETH got to 0.08 BTC twice in the last cycle. And if it was at 0.08 BTC at 96, 97K BTC, that puts ETH at 7.7K per ETH, right? So that's like where it kind of like could be, if you think it's going to go back to that similar sort of pricing. So I just think ETH has a big move. Like ETH is going to make a big move, and it just the more I see like the bearish sentiment out there, the more bullish I am on ETH. It just feels like nobody owns ETH. So yeah, so this chart, I'm just like waiting. I think it's going to bottom before year end when Bitcoin makes that final like push through 100K. You see a wealth effect with Bitcoin that tends to sort of lead to this rotation. And then that's when like your neighbor is like asking you about like which meme coin to buy and things like that. Like I don't think we're quite there just yet.
I think when Bitcoin gets to 100K, there is that psychological aspect for an investor to go, what's my risk reward here? Like, should I really buy Bitcoin at 100K or have I missed it? Which always happens. This is what happens every time. And at that point, if ETH's sitting there at like 300 million or 400 or sorry, billion market cap, you're like, oh, okay, well, that thing could make it to $1 trillion, right? Bitcoin's already at 2 or 3 trillion, whatever. And so it seems much easier. And then of course that happens all the way down. And so I could see it once Bitcoin hits that 100K mark. But when that happens, I don't know. Like we still, like I said, rates are still high. QE still not started. Generally, that coincides with the bottoming of ETH BTC or the top of Bitcoin dominance and altcoin season starting. We kind of don't have any of that. I want to get into comparing Sol and ETH, but let's stick on ETH for a second here because this is the one that everyone I know is asking about, and it's just like, what's going on? This thing's like a rock; it doesn't move. It's had a couple little pumps here, but like Solana's already reached all-time highs. Bitcoin is smashing all-time highs, close to 100K. What do you think's going on with ETH? Anything in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, this has all like been pretty healthy for ETH. I think, what we've seen is like basically execution on the roadmap, in my view, of like basically they're doing what they said they were going to do. They're scaling through L2s. We're seeing more users, more like fundamentals, like moving to L2. We had this protocol upgrade, in March, EIP 4844 lowered fees. And so like you basically opened up a glut of new block space, and we haven't reached like that sort of like new phase of new users coming in. And so it just kind of looks like ETH's fundamentals have sort of disappeared because like fees, they're coming back a little bit now, but fees dropped off a cliff. And it just kind of, and all of that was happening while Solana was ripping and adding new users, and Phantom's, I think, the number one utility app all of a sudden out there. So like you have that happening. To me, it's a bit of a head fake of like the fundamentals actually don't match like what's actually happening there. And then price action, like price moves first in crypto. This is like a unique thing in crypto. Like fundamentals come after the price moves. The narrative comes after the price moves. So like the fact that ETH hasn't really rallied yet, the narrative becomes like there's something wrong here. I just don't think there's actually something wrong here. I think it's more the price just needs to move. The price will move. And then all of a sudden you start to see announcements happening. Like there are lots of good things happening within the ecosystem. I'm looking for potentially like Robinhood to announce they're building an L2 or something. Like I know there's Wall Street firms out there that are looking at what Coinbase is doing within the Ethereum ecosystem. And like, that's a template for somebody else to do the same thing. The price starts to move. You start to see an announcement like this. All of a sudden, the whole narrative flips. So just keep an eye out there. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but I just think that gets interesting. And then all of a sudden the narrative flips to, oh, Solana's just meme coins. Look, this is Wall Street chain over here. Solana's just meme coins. And like now all of a sudden the market's thinking differently. So keep an eye on that. I don't have like really strong conviction on that, but it's definitely possible. And like what you just laid out with like what typically happens with the Bitcoin moves first, you have the rotation. It sounds just so simple and like easy, but like I just think the institutions are going to do the same exact thing. They're looking at Bitcoin. They're going to be like, how many more multiples can Bitcoin go? Why don't we go into the ETH ETF? It only has about it's like 1.5% of Bitcoin's ETF flows. That makes no sense. ETH is valued around 22% of Bitcoin. I think that gap is going to close big time on the ETF, and we should see price action on Ethereum as that plays out. So
I couldn't agree more. And if you think back to last cycle again, what happened in November, December before ETH started pumping? It was the ETH death party. So for those that don't know, I think it was a Twitter space or something, or maybe it was Clubhouse back then. I don't know. But a bunch of Bitcoiners had this like ETH is dead party. And that marked the very bottom. And come January, ETH just went through the roof. So it was like when the sentiment got as bad as it could possibly be for ETH, it just kind of took off and just dominated. And I could see the same thing happening here this time around. It feels like we've said the exact same setup as 4 years ago, which is wild. Although there is one caveat this time, which is Solana exists. And last cycle, that didn't exist. And so last cycle, there wasn't an alt chain that was like just kicking ass and doing it for the last 2 years. And so like it kind of felt like it was Bitcoin only. But this cycle, it's not Bitcoin only because there's Solana and all of its meme coins. And so that's the thing that makes people go, oh, maybe ETH actually is dead this time or not going to catch up. Now, I completely disagree. I agree with you that like in terms of fundamentals, ETH is just absolutely crushing it. They've created all this new block space, which is huge. They have, so many L2s, companies that are building on their Sony. And I also think Robinhood will probably launch one, maybe PayPal and probably many more. Deutsche Bank just launched an L2. Like, come on, this is actually crazy. But let's compare. Let's talk about Sol ETH. What is your well, actually, I will explain your take first because your report that you put out, it was last week or earlier, I think it was on Friday, which is quite interesting, which was just looking at the discount of Sol versus ETH, which is currently at about 70% discount to Ethereum. And what's interesting is 2 years ago, almost, you wrote that the discount was like, what was it, like 98% or something. Sol was like $8. And you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Sol's got to catch up. At Pro, we also wrote a report saying the same thing. And then I think earlier this year, you did another one. You said, Solana has like an 84% discount to Ethereum. And by the way we're getting these discounts is basically just looking at the market cap of Solana versus ETH. And that's how much less it's worth. And so it went from 84% back in, I think it was July, you said. Now we're sitting at 70%. And so the question once again is Sol undervalued versus ETH? I would love for you to just walk us through kind of how you think through that and give me your takes there.
Yeah, so exactly. Big move has already played out here in terms of repricing of Sol relative to ETH. And so what I'm trying to do, here, and especially with this report, is just sort of like draw a line in the sand of like, okay, imagine the cycle starting today, and let's look at the fundamentals of Ethereum versus Solana and make a determination on if we think it's still underpriced relative to ETH. And I kind of just went through, when I look at these comparisons, I'm using like a combination of Ethereum plus the L2s. But then I'm sort of just comparing back to ETH versus Sol. I think that confuses people a little bit. The reason we do this is that the L2s, in my view, are creating like new demand for ETH, the asset, and also driving like new demand for settlement fees down to ETH validators and stakers. So I'm including the L2s in the sort of comp analysis, and then just comparing, basically ETH to Sol. And looking back to Q in July when we looked at this, when it was I think it was an 84% discount at that time. When you looked at the fees, Solana was about 27% during Q2 versus Ethereum. That has closed to now it's 49% over the last 90 days when we just looked at this. So another like sort of big move there, just in terms of fees. That means there's just more users, there's just more activity happening. Solana, I will say, just to caveat those numbers, I'm only looking at transaction fees there. So if we included MEV, that number changes to where like today Solana is basically at par with Ethereum in terms of fees. If you just look at the last month, the last 2 months, the reason for that is there's like twice as much MEV coming off of Solana than there is Ethereum. So if you want to look at with MEV, they're actually like, basically neck and neck right now. We can talk about MEV. There's probably a separate discussion, but so that's fees. If we look at like DEX volumes, I think it was the next chart. Back in Q2, Solana was doing about 36% of Ethereum plus the L2's DEX volumes. Today, when we look at the last 90 days, that's 57%. So again, Solana closing the gap here. Moving on to like stablecoin volumes, or stablecoin supplies here. Solana still has a very like limited amount of supply, as you can see in this chart, compared to ETH and the L2s. Kind of interesting because Solana has high volumes. There just isn't a ton of like value being sort of stored on Solana. So this has made a small move. It was 3.5% of Ethereum in the L2s back in Q2. That has moved up to 4.1%. So not a lot happening in terms of the supply of stablecoins.
For context of those that are listening, not watching, ETH is what, 110 billion or close to 110 billion of stablecoin supply, and Solana, I mean, I can't even see this number here, but it's probably like 3, 4, 5.
It's around 4. Yeah, it's pretty small today. And what's interesting is like you start to look at that, and actually like if you look at Base and Arbitrum, they're like at par with Solana in terms of stablecoin supply. So that gets interesting. And then you start to, if you want to take this analysis a step further, look at like some of those valuations, the L2s, which we won't get to in this discussion. But looking at moving on to stablecoin volumes here, this was kind of interesting. So back in Q2, Solana did like 4.7 trillion in stablecoin volume. It's not on this. Most of that's not on this chart. We're just looking at June through November here, which was like twice as much stablecoin volume as Ethereum did during Q2. This number has dropped off a cliff for Solana. So they did significantly less volume, to where it's about 30% of Ethereum in the L2s, which did about 3.1 trillion during the last 90 days. So, why is this dropping off like that for Solana? I think there was just tons of algorithms, bots, wash trading, things like that sort of got cleaned up over the last 90 days or so. But it still gives you there. 30% is still pretty high. What's also interesting there is Artemis has some pretty good data on like peer-to-peer versus like what's happening with just stablecoins on DEXs and centralized exchanges. And only about 6% of Solana's sort of volumes for stablecoins is coming from peer-to-peer. So this is mostly meme coins, speculation, trading on Solana. Ethereum's closer to 30%. So it's got a little bit more peer-to-peer transactions, maybe a little more just like pure utility of these stablecoins than Solana has.
We've got one more metric, which is TVL.
Yeah, one more here, rapid fire with the data. So TVL is, so if we look at TVL, Solana has, where do we move here? TVL, so it was 6.3% in Q2. That has jumped up to 12.3%. So similar to like stablecoin supply, not a ton of value being stored on Solana, but I would say the capital efficiency of the network is better than ETH, where like you basically have what is stored there, it's moving around. Like the velocity of the money on there is moving faster than Ethereum, but just not a ton of value stored there. We also looked at like flows. Like, are there flows? Is like Solana grabbing TVL from ETH and the L2s? Very small amount. It was about 2% over the last 90 days. So I don't know how you interpret all this. I sort of looked at all this and I said, this feels about right. Yes, like there's still like Solana sort of still seems to be growing a little bit on the fee side, on DEX volumes. It's just pure speculation. This is just like meme coin mania on Solana. And so like, if I was seeing like, okay, there's all these other use cases being built and like all this other fundamental activity, I might think slightly differently about it. But to me, that valuation feels like it's made the big move. Going forward, I think is somewhat of a toss up here. But I'm actually curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think Sol probably still outperforms this cycle, but probably not back end, like when we get to the bear market. So it just because it's still a smaller asset by a pretty large margin. What worries me, so like I'm still very bullish ETH, even though it hasn't had its big move. I think that's one of the reasons why I think it does so well is because it's got to catch up, and I think it will. I think institutions, as they come in, like you said, you think they will. I think they're going to come in, and there's the opportunity to buy them through the ETF, which Solana doesn't have yet. And so I think we will get some big bids there, and ETH will play catch up. What worries me on the Solana side is I see all the metrics are increasing and the fee revenues, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that L1s are necessarily valued based off fees. It's not like a traditional company. And
Yep.
so I take that with a grain of salt. I
Yep.
just worry that 90% of all the basic activity on Solana is meme coins. And as much as and this is why I think Sol still outperforms, I don't think meme coins stop. I think they continue to get crazier throughout this cycle. And so I think probably as a result of that, the narrative continues until it doesn't, which at some point it will stop. And then that worries me. But I don't know when that is. Is that in 1 month? Is that in 3 months? Is that in 6 months? Is that in 12 months? Like, I honestly don't really know. There are big unlocks coming for Sol in Q1.
Yep.
Is that really going to matter though? It's hard to say. So it's for me, I'm bullish on both. I hold them both. I'm actually about even on both in terms of my portfolio personally.
Yep.
And so like, I don't know. I don't really have a strong conviction on either side. I just think both of them have a lot of room to grow over the next year, which makes me happy. I guess.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense what you just laid out there, where maybe it does. That's sort of where I'm coming in, and maybe it does slightly outperform. My targets, I guess, have always been, and I haven't come off this, is like 10 trillion or so for the total crypto market cap. And then you sort of back down. And if you don't believe it's 10 trillion, you can go to 9, but you can essentially back into where you think Bitcoin and ETH are going to get to. If you say, okay, well, maybe Bitcoin dominance is usually around 40% at the top. If it's 10 trillion, that gets you to 4 trillion, it's like 200K BTC. And then you can say, okay, well, what percentage of ETH, where does it usually get to? Where could that fall? If it's 35%, it gets you to like almost 12K ETH. And then you look at Solana and you're like, okay, well, Solana is about 30% of ETH today. Is it going to inch up slightly and it maybe goes to 35%? You can sort of back into that. And that gets you to like 1,000 SOL, right? So it's still, if it goes to 35% and we do get close to that 10 trillion, that's how you get to like, a 4x or so from these levels. And then the question is like, does Solana meme coins just like totally destroy ETH, and like the Solana DeFi just Radium just wildly outperform Uniswap and things like that? That's kind of how I'm thinking of it. It's sort of a simple way to do it, but it tends to work pretty well. Crypto, just human behavior just repeats in crypto, and I think that's the thing you should always kind of fall back on.
Do you think so? Obviously, the meme coin craze right now in Solana has been beneficial to Solana. I mean, it's bringing a shit ton of users, and obviously a lot of fee revenue, et cetera. And so this is great, and it's kind of bootstrapping this network, right? Like DeFi is getting a lot more action than it normally would. Radium and the DEXs are getting a lot more action than they normally would, and so like it's kind of stress testing. It's, as you said, Phantom is kind of the number one, I think, app in all of the US right now, at least for utility apps. But do you think there's a negative side to this? I think you wrote in one of your reports that you're hearing or seeing that institutions might be a little bit wary to invest or build on Solana because of the meme coin stuff. Can you kind of dive into that take just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing some rumors that like, perception is reality, right? So like, perception is, this is just a meme coin casino over on Solana. There isn't like as much sort of like real institutional activity. BlackRock has the Biddle fund on Ethereum. You have like firms like E&Y that are building on Ethereum, right? You don't really see this on Solana just yet. There's some sort of green shoots of this, but you do worry a little bit that this becomes the perception, and then you don't get these announcements. You don't see as much sort of serious builders like going to Solana. It's really more the consumer app, consumer chain. Maybe that's how it plays out, and that's how the future of finance is Ethereum. I still think Solana, there'll be a massive market for this sort of like consumer-based L1, and Ethereum, maybe that's where DeFi actually plays out on Ethereum, or serious professional DeFi. Right. We'll see. But I do think narratives matter. Perception definitely matters. And, the fact that I think because Ethereum has the ETF, that is an advantage. It just is an advantage for this cycle. So
as we wrap up, we're just going to throw one more question at you and put you on the hot seat here, which is, if you were allocating today, and you could say this maybe personally, we've talked about where we think we're at in the cycle. Maybe Bitcoin is topped, maybe not. If not, it's probably soon. We kind of discussed ETH and Sol. We're sort of no strong conviction on either side and who it performs. how are you allocating? Is it just 50-50? Are you still holding some Bitcoin? Like what's your thought between the three? Or maybe there's something else you're holding on to.
Yeah. So personally, I'm pretty even on BTC, ETH, Sol, to be honest. Like I sort of rotated Bitcoin holdings into Sol like in early 23, late 22, early 23. I actually added to ETH like more recently, but I'm mostly like pretty allocated, and I'm looking for more strategic stuff, like I guess farther down the risk curve, like which sort of areas, are there any areas of like sort of value today, high conviction meme coin potential bets. I do think that like we will get to a point, we haven't got there just yet, but you have like, I actually think there's some L2s that look kind of interesting right now. Like Blast, for example, is like a 250 million market cap. You look at some of these charts, they just are been down and to the right. At some point, if ETH gets a bid, people will actually go farther out to the risk curve on some of these L2s. So I think there's some potential opportunities there. And like, I do think we get to a level where, the L2s have unlocks, things like Sui, things like Tia, things like Aptos that are unlocking. Like at some point, like that just doesn't matter in bull markets. We haven't seen it yet. So I do feel like there's a chance that something like a Tia or a Sui or something, gets to 100 billion market cap plus. I do think we're going to see this, and just trying to figure out where those opportunities are.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, Michael, thanks so much for joining us. It was great to have you on. We'll have to get you back on again. For the listeners, check out the DeFi Report. It's a free newsletter, and he does some amazing analysis. I think it's weekly. So make sure to see it. You can see it in the show notes. Go check that out and subscribe there. But otherwise, listeners, thanks so much for listening in. Mike, thanks for coming on. And everyone have a great day.
As always, if you liked today's episode, please hit subscribe and make sure you follow us so you don't miss out on the next one. There's also a link in the description to our free 5-minute daily newsletter where we simplify crypto for you while making you laugh. And if you're willing to step up your crypto investing game, we're going to also leave a link for Milk Road Pro. You get access to our portfolio where you can see exactly what we are buying. This is your number one resource to help you invest successfully in crypto. One final note, this show is for educational purposes only, and nothing we say is financial advice. Investing in crypto or any asset is risky, and you should never invest more than you can afford to lose. Thanks so much for listening in, my friends. Have a wicked awesome day.